Hey there, my growers and friends. Welcome to yet another episode of Growing with Gray, the podcast that aims to take your gardening dreams and shape them into a delicious reality. Today's episode, what we're going to be focusing on specifically, is going to be beginner friendly berries and fruits that you can start growing in your garden. So, needless to say, it's going to be a very interesting episode. Let's get into some botanical talks, right? My name is Graylen Brown, and I'm a Texas master gardener, and my whole goal is to help you get out and grow something. So, let's do just that. The berries that we're going to be talking about today, consider them like the superheroes of your garden, because these are some fantastic berries that are really just going to show out for you. And that being strawberries, blueberries, raspberries, gooseberries, and then melon as well. Additionally, at the end of the video, I'm going to give you a bonus berry that you can really consider to grow as well. And yes, you did hear me correctly when I mentioned melons. Melons are technically berries. And that brings me to another point. Before I start to break down the five that we're going to talk about, strawberries, raspberries, blueberries, gooseberries, and melons, botanically speaking, most of the commonly referred to berries are actually not berries at all. And I mean, we're speaking from a botanical standpoint, so we're talking about how they grow. For instance, strawberries and raspberries are actually aggregate fruit. See, interestingly enough, a berry is a fruit that develops from a single flower with one ovary and typically has several seeds. The entire ovary wall ripens into a soft fruit. And now, based off of this definition, strawberries and raspberries are again those aggregate fruits. A strawberry is mostly just a swollen flower receptacle with real fruits being the tiny seeds on the outsides. Raspberries are a cluster of multiple small drupelets that form around a central core. And now, get this, the real plot twist, many fruit we don't consider berries are actually berries. So we're talking bananas, tomatoes, avocados, and yes, even eggplants are all botanically berries. Even more surprising, cucumbers and pumpkins qualify as berries as well. With that being said, let's get into that first aggregate fruit that we want to discuss. And that's going to be your instant gratification fruit, and that's your strawberries. Strawberries, by far, are my favorite fruit to grow. I grow countless amounts of strawberries. One, because my kids love them so much. So you can't beat that. Plus, they're super easy to grow as long as you follow these key facts. When it comes to your strawberries, your first and most important step is going to be the soil. Key thing to remember when it comes to soil for strawberries, you're looking for a slightly acidic, well draining soil that is rich in organic matter. The most basic recipe for your soil is going to be 60% sand, and we're talking about coarse horticultural sand, not beach sand. Then next, you're going to want to have 30% topsoil. Your topsoil is going to have both a mixture of silt as well as clay deposits in there as well. And then the final being your organic matter. Now, from your organic matter, you can use things like peat moss or sphagnum moss, but one of the easiest and most readily available things to use is just some organic compost. Now, when it comes to growing your strawberries, as far as your avenue of how you're going to grow them, they can be grown from seed. They definitely can. And I've had, the funny thing is, I've actually had seeds germinate on the outside of overripened fruit that I honestly just kind of missed in the garden, and the seeds have started to germinate this way. But I'm going to give you a simpler process to grow your strawberries. It goes back to what I was saying in like video one, as far as time and effort. How much time and effort do you want to spend on your garden, right? My preferred method of growing strawberries is actually growing via bare roots. There is actually a plethora of online suppliers, nurseries that will grow strawberries and send you dormant roots that you can actually just soak in water and start growing right out the gates. And what I mean by dormant roots, see, one thing you have to realize is that with strawberries, they're not an annual plant like some of the plants we talked about before when we talked about tomatoes and so forth. They're actually a perennial. So what happens is when they start growing and we get into like the winter season, they will go into dormancy and kind of slow down their growing process. And then soon as spring comes around, they start producing again. And so this is going to be the reason why I'm going to lean heavily on the fact that growing bare root strawberries is going to be a instant gratification for you when you're trying to grow strawberries for the first time, because Truth be told, even though strawberries are perennial, they almost act like a biennial, like carrots. You know, you'll really start to get your fruit production on that second year when it comes to your strawberries. So if you're going with a bare root strawberry, like I said, that you can purchase from an online supplier or even some of your local nurseries, you already have a plant that is on maybe its second or third year, so you're guaranteed to get fruit. Now, when it comes to your different varieties of strawberries, there's a plethora out there, but there's two specific cultivars that I would like for you to kind of consider when you're thinking about your strawberries. And that's going to be this. One, everbearing strawberries. These are a type of strawberry that actually they produce their fruit throughout the entire growing season. So typically your berries are going to be a little bit smaller because think about it, your strawberry plant is going to be putting its effort into constantly producing strawberries throughout the season. I mean, here in North Texas, I had my strawberry plants right before they went dormant for the winter. They were still producing up until November. Now, your second is going to be your June bearing strawberry. Your June bearing strawberry is going to be kind of like how we were talking about tomatoes, right? When we were talking about indeterminate versus determinate. These are going to be almost like determinate tomatoes, where the plant focuses all of its fruit production at one specific time. Now, what makes this good is you can use those berries for like making your jams and jellies and pies and so forth because you're getting all your berries at once. You can freeze them, preserve them, however you want to store them. But the only thing about that is that you only get that one and done because the plant is focusing all its energy on giving all the flowers it possibly can and then fruit all at one time. So here's my pro tip for you. Diversify. Grow both everbearing strawberries as well as June berries. That way you can get multiple harvests throughout the entire growing season. And now when it comes to our method of how we're going to grow our strawberries, we're in luck because strawberries don't require much space, so they're diverse. You can plant them in either containers. I would say go with a container that at least has a depth of about 8 to 10 inches. It can easily be planted in raised beds or traditional rows. And then another cool thing about strawberries, they like to spread themselves. They like to send out little offshoots of themselves called runners. And now these runners, it's a little bit of a, I don't know, debate when it comes to strawberry growers. Most growers would tell you clip off the runners because that's going to slow down your fruit production because the plant is spending its energy on trying to propagate itself. And this is true. But instead of just cutting off those runners and discarding them, I take those runners, clip them off, and I use them to propagate new strawberry plants. So essentially, you could create an endless supply of strawberries. And now let's talk watering. Because with your strawberries, one thing you want to realize with strawberries is they don't like being in standing water. They don't like wet feet. That's the reason why we have that well drained sandy loam mix because they don't like standing in their own water. What you're looking for in your strawberries, if you're growing in raised beds and or if you're growing in traditional rows, I would recommend watering about once a week, and we're looking to 1 to 2 inches of water per plant. Um, Anything exceeding that, now granted, caveat, this does depends on your specific growing zone and it depends on your soil, how much water is whipping away from the plants and so forth. But don't overwater is essentially what I'm saying. Now, on the opposite side of the spectrum, when it comes to container growing, if you're going to grow in containers, depending on how well draining your soil is, and of course, how much evaporation is going on in your microclimate, you honestly may have to water daily. So just keep an eye out for your water regimen and find out what works best for you. And now we got our plants, we know how we're going to grow them, and we know what means we're going to grow them. Let's now talk fertilization because strawberries do need fertilizing because they are berry producers. They're producing fruit. So, with that being said, if we're going to establish a garden and we are doing traditional rows or we're doing raised beds or something of that nature, first and foremost, if you're using your existing soil, if you're using your native soil, I would highly recommend, like I've said before, reaching out to your local ag extension and testing your soil first because you can't add fertilizer to a soil if you don't know what your starting point is. I really have to stress this because you may be introducing too much fertilizer because it may not need it and you're wasting money. But if you do need to fertilize, first and foremost, before starting your plants, I would go with an aged compost. You want to go with a premium aged compost that already has had time to break down and has those microorganisms in it that's going to help feed your plant. And now, once you're in the actual growing season, what I like to incorporate in my garden, I'm all about the slow releases. So I prefer using like worm casting and again, compost as far as my fertilization goes on my strawberries. But if I'm looking for a quick boost of nitrogen, I will every couple of months, I'm talking every 2 to 3 months during the growing season, I would probably add like a fish emulsion. Because typically with your fish emulsion, it's going to be higher on the nitrogen scale, which what we know about our nitrogen does leach away when we have frequent waterings going on. And then it's lower on the potassium and the phosphorus scale, which is great because phosphorus is a type of nutrient that stacks on top of itself. And you don't want to have an overabundance of phosphorus in your plants. And then once I've gotten to the flowering and fruiting stage, I would alternate back and forth between my fish emulsion and then incorporating compost tea. If you'd like to know the recipe for compost tea, I did actually do a video a while back on compost tea, and I can give you the full description and breakdown on how to make that. And now what I would like to do is I would like to provide you with some options as far as your strawberries. I'm going to give you options based off of June bearing as well as ever bearing. Because remember, I told you having that diversity is really going to be key when it comes to growing and having a plentiful amount of strawberries. Then I'm also break them down based off of heat tolerant and cold tolerant, depending on where you're at in the world. Additionally, I have a friend and subscriber that lives in a very interesting part of the world, and she needs specific recommendations for the type of strawberries that are good for her climate. So, Anne Marie, I haven't forgot about you. I have those recommendations for you coming up soon. All right, so when it comes to your heat tolerant varieties, first we're going to look at our June bearers, right? So, June bearing, I would go with a Chandler. Chandler excels in zones 5 through 8, and it can handle some of that southern heat. Next up, you have the Camarosa, which is a vigorous producer and it's good in warm climates. And now for our everbearing varieties, we have our Albion, which is heat resistant and has an excellent flavor. Next up, we have our San Andreas, which has been developed specifically for California's heat conditions. And then finally, we have our Seascape, which is adaptable to most warm climates. And now for our cold tolerant varieties. First up, our June berry. And the first one I have for you is the Honeyo. It's hardy up to zone 3 and it's a reliable producer. You also have your Jewel, which is excellent for your northern regions. Then you have your Early Glow, which is very cold hardy and disease resistant, which is important. And now for our everbearings, we have a Fort Laramie, which is extremely cold hardy, all the way up to zone 3. Then your Tribute, which is good tolerance of cold, and your Ozark Beauty. And now the beautiful thing about the Ozark Beauty is it's the best of both worlds because the Ozark Beauty has both heat tolerance and cold tolerance. So believe it or not, all the way here in North Texas, I actually have some Ozark Beauties that have been doing fantastically for about 4 years now. And now these next varieties are specifically for my friend Anne Marie, who lives in a Mediterranean climate in central Spain. And now you're in luck because you actually have multiple options that are native to your region. For instance, the Fortuna was developed in Spain and has excellent heat tolerance. Also, you have the Sabrina. It's a popular Spanish variety and has good disease resistance. Next up, you have the Camarosa. It does extremely well in Mediterranean climates. And then finally, you have the Medina. It's a Spanish variety with good drought tolerance. So, given your circumstances, I think these would be four native Spanish strawberries that you should definitely consider. And then I also think by supplementing with some of the other varieties that I mentioned before, for instance, like the San Andreas and the Albion, as well as the Festival, those would be good options as well because they're heat tolerant, some are drought tolerant, and I think they would do well in their climate as well. And also, I'd be excited to know which option you actually decided to go with. All right. I know I just gave you a lot of information to process about growing strawberries. Now, I do have other strawberry growing guides. I think I have a whole playlist dedicated to just growing strawberries on the channel itself. But of course, if you have any questions and or concerns about strawberries, you can always leave me a comment and I pride myself on trying to get back to you within the first 24 to 48 hours. Now on to our next fruit. And yet again, not a berry. We're still on our aggregate fruit. And this one's going to be raspberry. Raspberry, I like to consider the resilient warrior of the whole entire berry family. Why? Because it's extremely hardy and can grow in multiple climates with no problem. Plus, it's really like one of those kind of set it and forget it kind of shrubs because you really don't have to maintain it much. And just like your strawberries, it's a perennial. So you're going to get multiple harvests for multiple seasons and a plethora of berries. Now, with that being said, with a raspberry, you might actually want to look at some kind of means of creating a mechanical barrier around your bush. So now that you're creating all of this food, you are essentially inviting the local fauna to come and break bread with you. Now, when it comes to your soil conditions, you're actually going to be looking for something very similar to the soil conditions for strawberry. So again, that's going to be that well-draining, slightly acidic. And when we mean slightly acidic, we're talking about a range of about 5.5 to a 6.5 is our window. But the sweet spot being around 6 to a 6.2 as far as pH is concerned. And then, of course, rich in organic matter. When it comes to our fertilization, again, like our strawberries, I'm going to kind of follow that same regimen. First, being that I'm all about the slow release as far as fertilization goes. So I'm talking earthworm castings, I'm talking about compost and so forth. But in the early spring, I would supplement with a little bit of something higher on the nitrogen side. And then as the season progresses along, supplementing, adding something with a little bit more potassium and a little bit more phosphorus, especially once we start establishing those flowers and so forth. And now, when it comes to watering, you're going to want about 1 to 2 inches of water a week and making sure you're achieving consistent moisture. But you know what? Something's just dawned on me. I know I've told you, as well as you probably have heard other people tell you 1 to 2 inches of water or giving you it in measurements on the imperial scale. But how do you figure that out? How do you know exactly how much water? Let's say, for instance, if you're using a standard gardening hose. So, with that being said, let's think about it in regards to gallons per minute as opposed to just using inches. Okay. And we're going to have to do a little bit of math to figure this out. And I'm going to give you generalized figures because something to take in mind, it's going to depend. It's going to vary based off of your existing infrastructure, where you're at in the world, plus the diameter of your hose. That varies. If we're talking about half inch, we're probably looking at about maybe 2 to 4 gallons per minute. If we're talking about something extreme as like a 3/4 inch hose, we're looking at about 4 to 6 gallons a minute. So it will vary. So based off of that, how much time do I need to spend? Let's say if I'm watering a 4x6 raised bed, that's going to be an area of about 24 square feet. So based off of that, based off of, let's say, a half inch hose, you're talking about maybe 5 minutes or so. Taking into consideration, we're just kind of speaking in generalities because, the diameter of your hose, your specific water pressure, whether or not you're using a spray nozzle, all of those different things can affect your GPM, your gallons per minute. So, but this is just kind of a gist, so to speak, to kind of help you along. I hope this helps. Now, in regards to our planting methods for raspberries, if let's look at containers first. If we're going to go with containers, I would say you're going to need a large container. We're talking about a 15 to 20 gallon container, something like as if we were trying to do tomatoes. In this situation, I would say this would probably be good in grow bags because you can get grow bags. And they would be less expensive than opposed to like a hard ABS plastic or like a terracotta. It's gonna get very expensive if you start going that route. So I think grow bags would be the best situation here. Also, do take in mind you're probably going to have to water a little bit more because since you're in containers, you're going to have more of that water kind of wicking away from your plants, especially if we're talking about using grow bags. Now, in regards to your raised beds, I would say make sure that you space out appropriately. You're talking about in between your rows, at least 2 to 3 feet, and make sure you're adding in some support wiring system, kind of like you would do if you were growing grapes. Now, that's actually another berry, a berry we haven't even talked about yet. Yep, grapes are berries. Also, going back to our container gardening, make sure that if we're doing the container, we also have something for the raspberry to trellis on as well. With traditional rows, I would say, again, let's make sure we're maintaining the proper spacing for your plants, that 2 to 3 feet, just like we talked about before with the raised beds. And then make sure that they're planted somewhere where they're going to get that full sun and again have some kind of support system in place. For our varieties that I would recommend, I would start off by saying for the southern regions, the southern states, and we're talking about zones 6 through 9, I would go with a Dorman red because it does significantly well in like zones 7 through 9 where you can really get that southern heat going on. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, for the cold variety, I would go with a Nova. It actually does really well in zones 3 through 8 and can survive many of those harsher winters. Wow, look at the time. I didn't even realize that I had kind of exceeded my time limit. See, when it comes to these videos, I try to keep them like around about 20 minutes because I don't want to overload you with way too much information all at once. So, with that being said, I didn't even get to actually talk about any berries today. I mean, we talked about strawberries, we talked about our raspberries, but our true berries that I wanted to discuss are the blueberries, the gooseberries, and then, of course, melons, and then an additional berry as well. So I think what I'm gonna end up having to do with this video is actually just break it up to part one, part two. So I hope I provided enough information so that you can feel confident about going out and try to grow some fruit in your garden. And like I said before, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to ask. I'm a former educator, so there's no such thing as a bad question, in my opinion. I will always give you my undivided attention and help you as best I possibly can.